I'm Angela Holloway, 47, a brigadier general in the United States Air Force and the incoming commander of the 89th Airlift Wing at Joint Base Andrews, the unit that flies the president. For 30 years, I gave my father everything a daughter can give a man who flew fighters. The day I took command of his old wing, a young captain on the apron grabbed my arm and shouted at me to get off his tarmac, and what happened next changed the way my family sat at its own dinner table. Have you ever been dismissed by the person whose approval you spent your whole life chasing? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You are not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you are tuning in from. And if you have ever had to keep walking while someone tried to put a hand on your arm, hit that like button and subscribe. The first time I climbed a cockpit ladder, I was 10 years old at Langley, and my father was the one holding it steady for me. It was the fall of 1988, Take Your Daughter to Work Day. He had walked me through the F-15 line with both hands behind his back, the way he walked everywhere, like a man who had been measured for a uniform and had never gotten over the dignity of the cut. The crew chief lifted me up so I could look down into the cockpit. I did not touch anything. I had been told 1,000 times not to touch anything. I looked at the throttle and the stick and the green slab of the heads-up display, and I understood the way a child understands a sentence she will not be able to explain for another decade. That this was what I wanted. My father watched me from the ladder. Something quiet and proud crossed his face. He did not speak. I climbed down on my own. The walk back across the apron to his Bronco was silent and full. And the silence of that walk is the first piece of evidence I will offer in this story. Because the rest of the story is going to be about the noise. We lived in base housing at Andrews. My father, then Major Russell Holloway, flew F-15s out of Langley and commuted up on weekends. He had married my mother in 1974, the year he qualified F-4 Phantoms. My brother Bennett was born in 1976. I was born in 1978 at Wright-Patterson. Friday afternoons were the religion of my childhood. My father would come home in his flight suit, and my mother would be in the kitchen, and I would be on the front lawn in bare feet, because I had been on the front lawn in bare feet every Friday since I could walk. The smell of him coming out of the Bronco was jet fuel and sweat and the faint vinyl of the cockpit, and that smell became, for the rest of my life, the smell of safety and longing both. He picked me up. He told me about a thunderstorm cell that almost ate his element near the Outer Banks. I listened to him like he was reading the gospel. When I was 8 years old, my father was the best pilot in the world. I had not yet learned that other people's fathers might also be the best pilot in the world. The category had only one entry. My mother watched us from the kitchen window, drying her hands on a dish towel, smiling the smile women of her generation were taught to smile when their husbands came home in one piece. She did not say very much. She did not have to. She managed the house. She managed me. She managed Bennett. She managed my father's mood in the basement on the days the Squadron called and the news was bad. Bennett was 2 years older. He was tall for his age in the way the older brothers always are, and quiet for his age in the way that, decades later, would let him fly Boeing 777s out of Atlanta for Delta without ever raising his voice on the radio. He did not want to be his father. He had figured that out before I had figured out that I did. He said it out loud, at the dinner table, the summer I turned 14 and he turned 16. My father had announced over pot roast that there was a USAFA prep program slot opening up the next year. He was talking about it as if it were for Bennett. Bennett pushed his peas around the plate. Bennett looked at my father from underneath the dark hair that fell across his forehead, the way only 16-year-old hair falls across a forehead, and he said, with no anger in it at all, "I don't want to drop bombs, Dad. I want to fly people." My father did not raise his voice. He just stopped looking at Bennett for the rest of the meal. Bennett caught my eye across the table. I understood. My father did not start looking at Bennett again until late September. By that point, he had already decided that the family pilot was going to be me. In the spring of 1996, I told my mother first that I had been accepted to the Air Force Academy. I told her in the kitchen on a Wednesday night when my father was in the basement with the news on. She put her hand over her mouth. She cried quietly. Then she opened her arms. We stood there for a long time. The kitchen radio was playing something I do not remember. I told my father at dinner the next night. He set down his fork. He took a breath. He said, very quietly, that he was proud of me, and he meant it. He said, very quietly, that the flying program was going to grind me up. He meant that too. He said it in the way men of his generation said a thing they meant as a warning and the woman receives as a challenge. I received it as a challenge. That night, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and thought, I will not be ground up. I will fly something he has never flown. I did not yet know that those two sentences would turn out to be the entire story of the next 30 years. The U.S. AFA commissioning was in May of 2000. My father came in his retired lieutenant colonel's blues. He had retired 3 years earlier, at 25 years of service, never having made full colonel, and he had taken the pilot job at Delta because that is what retired lieutenant colonels of his generation did. He pinned one of my gold bars, personally. The crowd applauded politely. He held my shoulders for a second longer than the photographer's shutter. He did not speak. I did not need him to. The photograph sits in his hallway in Bowie, Maryland. It is still there today. Every time I have walked past it in the last 26 years, I have understood that we were both, in that frame, telling ourselves a story about who I was going to be that we did not yet realize we did not agree on. But that was later. That came after Vance. That came after Charleston. That came after Balad. That came after the day my father stopped attending my ceremonies and started, instead, hanging my brother's Delta epaulets in the hallway above my air medal. That came after I had learned what the shape of an empty chair looked like from a dais. That came years before I would walk a flight line at Joint Base Andrews in a blank flight suit in the dark of the morning, and a young captain would see me and decide to shout at me, and I would not turn my head. But none of that had happened yet in May of 2000. In May of 2000, my father pinned my bar in his retired blues and held my shoulders for a second longer than the photographer's shutter, and my mother wept beside him in her good hat. And Bennett, by then flying regional jets for a feeder carrier, was not in the audience. I did not notice his absence at the time. I was 22, and I had a flying assignment ahead of me. I did not yet know that absences would become the thing I learned to notice better than anything else. Bruce Vandermeer was a major when I met him. He was my flight commander at Vance Air Force Base, Enid, Oklahoma, the spring of 2002 at the end of UPT. I had done well, top quarter of my class. I had run the T1 track, which meant heavies, which meant tankers or airlifters at assignment night, not the T-38 track that fed fighters. I had, by then, also done what I had been thinking about doing since my second year at the academy. I had decided what I was going to fly. I had not told my father. I had not told my brother. I had told my mother, once, late on a Sunday night in 1998, in a phone call from the cadet dorm, and she had said only, "Sweetheart, I will be ready for that conversation when you are ready to have it with him." I had not been ready for the conversation. I was about to be made ready because UPT was about to end and the assignment night list was about to be posted, and you cannot enter the assignment night list in a fog. You have to enter it pointed at a thing. Bruce sat me down in his cubicle on a Tuesday morning. He had a coffee that smelled like he had reheated it 3 times. He had a stack of class folders. He had my folder on top. He said, "Holloway, what do you want?" I said, "C-17s." He raised an eyebrow. He did not pretend he had not heard. He did not pretend he was surprised. He had been watching me for 14 months. He was a fighter pilot, 10 years in the F-15E. He could have spent the meeting trying to talk me out of it. He did not. He said, "You could put in for an F-15E backseater conversion if you fought hard." I would write the letter. I said, "C-17s." He wrote it down. He looked at me for a long time. He said, "Your father is going to take that hard." I said, "I know." I had thought about it for 2 years. I had not chosen against my father. I had chosen for the missions I wanted to fly. The fact that those two things looked the same from the outside was not my problem. It would become my problem. It was already becoming my problem. I just did not yet know how big a problem. What I knew, sitting in Bruce's cubicle in Enid that Tuesday morning, was that I had decided what I wanted to do with the next 30 years of my flying life. I wanted to fly the airplanes that brought people home. I wanted to fly the airplanes that landed on dirt strips. I wanted to fly the airplanes that got told 2 hours before takeoff. That the mission had changed, and could the aircraft commander please divert into the worst weather she had ever seen to pick up 41 wounded and 1 Marine on a ventilator and a master sergeant who had spent the last 6 hours holding his platoon together with his voice. I wanted to bring people home. That was not a sentence I could say to my father at his dinner table. My father had been raised on a different sentence. My father had been raised on the sentence that said the man at the tip of the spear is the man with the gun, and the man with the gun is the man in the fighter, and everything else in the Air Force was the truck that carried the gun. He believed it. He believed it with the deep, comfortable belief that men of his generation believed everything. He was not wrong, exactly. He was just 2/3 right. The third he was not right about was the third I was about to spend my entire career inside. I went home for 2 days before I reported to Charleston. I told him in the kitchen on a Friday night. He was at the table with a tumbler of bourbon. He said nothing for the first 10 minutes. Then he asked in a careful voice whether I had thought about putting in a request to cross-train into a fighter cockpit later. I said no. He asked why. I said because I had chosen airlift. He said, "Angie, those things are trash haulers." My mother stood in the doorway. I did not raise my voice. I told him I was going to fly the missions I wanted to fly. He stopped talking. He went down to the basement. He did not come up before I left. The next morning I told my mother in the kitchen, where she was making me eggs, the way she had made me eggs since I was 4. I am not better than that, yet I am exactly that, and I am going to be very good at it. She nodded. She did not turn around. She kept making the eggs. She said, into the pan, "Sweetheart, he will figure it out." She was wrong. She was wrong about the timeline. She was right about the destination, but she was wrong about the timeline by 24 years. Charleston was the rest of my 20s, the 15th Airlift Squadron, the C-17, First Lieutenant in 2002, Captain in 2004, Aircraft Commander upgrade in 2005, First Iraq deployment in 2003, the second deployment in 2005 as a brand new aircraft commander. I learned what the inside of a CASVAC looks like at 3 in the morning with the lights down to red. I learned what a Marine looks like when he has been on a ventilator for 11 hours. I learned what the inside of my own head sounded like when I was the woman in the left seat and the airplane was mine, and the people in the back were mine and nobody was coming to help. In January of 2007, I flew a CASVAC out of a forward base under indirect fire and brought out 41 wounded, 6 of them on litter-mounted ventilators. On the recovery taxi at Balad, I saw one of the litter teams unloading a Marine who would not survive the flight to Landstuhl. I wrote the boy's name on the back of my hand with a Sharpie. I still had the Sharpie marks 2 days later when I called home from a payphone at Ramstein. I told my mother first. I always told my mother first. By the time the phone rang in my father's basement, the casualty count was already public. He told me when I got him on the line that he was glad I was safe. I waited for him to ask about the Marines. He did not ask. The Air Medal came that summer. He did not come to the ceremony. He had, by then, attended one Holloway flying ceremony since my commissioning, which was not mine. The one he had attended was Bennett's hire-on dinner at Delta in the spring of 2008, at the Hanscom Officers Club, a dinner my father threw himself for 20 people on his own dime. He stood up at that dinner. He raised a glass. He said his son had finally joined the family business and that flying for Delta was the real test, the one that separated the men from the rest. I was in the room. I was in Air Force service dress, fresh off a deployment, 4 ribbons new since the last time my father had seen me. I did not say anything. My mother caught my eye across the table and shook her head, just once. Bennett looked at his plate. Bennett, for the record, had never asked my father to make him the favorite. He had just stopped objecting. He found me at the bar afterward. He had 2 scotches in his hand. He gave me one. He said, "I'm sorry, Ange." I said, "It's not on you. It never was. Stop apologizing for what he is." He drank his scotch. He nodded. He did not say anything else. He has been, in his way, a good brother since. In 2012, I received the Distinguished Flying Cross. The mission was an Afghanistan run from 2009, an engine fire over hostile terrain, a recovery into Bagram on 3 engines, and a prayer. My mother sat in the front row at the ceremony. alone. My father was in Atlanta at a Delta retiree golf tournament. He had told my mother about the tournament 3 weeks before the ceremony. There was nothing to be done about it. She had put on her Sunday hat and driven to Andrews by herself. There is a particular kind of empty seat. A military daughter learns to recognize it the way other people recognize music. The shape of the absence is exactly his shape. You see it from the dais. You do not let it crack your face. The DFC sat in a drawer in my apartment for 6 years before I put it up on the wall. 2013 brought the selection for VC-25 training, the Presidential Airlift, the 89th Airlift Wing at Joint Base Andrews, the aircraft that flies the President of the United States. I got the phone call on a Thursday afternoon at Altus. I told my mother first, again. She cried. I told my father over Sunday dinner in Bowie. He set down his fork. He looked at the placemat. He said, after a long silence, "Trash hauler with a paint job." That was the sentence. That was the moment, looking back now from May of 2026, that something in me decided it was not going to keep trying to be loved by him the way I had been trying to be loved by him. I did not say that out loud at the table. I did not say it out loud anywhere, ever, because Holloway daughters do not announce that decision. They make it and they live it. But I made it, at the placemat, over a roast my mother had made. I made it and I kept eating, and I did not bring it up again. I pinned Lieutenant Colonel below the zone in 2014. The pinning was at Andrews. My mother came. My father did not. He had, the family later learned, a Delta retiree event in Charlotte. He had told my mother about the event 4 days before the pinning. He had told her it was on his calendar. By 2015, I was a VC-25 aircraft commander, flying POTUS missions. I cannot describe what it is to fly the airplane with the man it is named after sitting in the conference room behind the cockpit. I will not try. By 2017, I had taken command of the 1st Airlift Squadron, the squadron at Andrews that flies the President. I was the first woman to command that squadron in its history. My mother came to the change of command. My father did not. He had a doctor's appointment. He had not rescheduled it. By 2020, I was a colonel. By 2025, I was a brigadier general. My father attended the BG ceremony at the Pentagon because my mother packed his suitcase and his blues and got him into the car. He stood in the receiving line. He shook my hand. He said, "Congratulations," the way a stranger says it to a stranger, and he moved on. That night, at the family dinner my mother had organized at a Bowie steakhouse, my father did not say my name once. The vice chief of staff, who had come to the dinner because he had served with me at the Joint Staff, watched the table for 10 minutes and politely asked to be seated next to me for the rest of the meal. He did not say anything about my father. He did not have to. That was November of 2025. In January of 2026, I was assigned as the incoming commander of the 89th Airlift Wing, Joint Base Andrews, the wing my father had served at as a major in the 1980s, the wing that flies the President, the wing whose colors I would take on the 27th of May, in front of the man who had not said my name out loud in 8 months. The ceremony was set for 1,400 hours. My mother had put it on my father's calendar in January. She had told him in February that he was going to attend. She had told him in March that he was going to wear his blues. She had told him in April that he was going to ride in her car. She had not asked him. By the spring of 2026, my mother had stopped asking my father questions about his attendance at his daughter's ceremonies. She had begun, very quietly, in her own way, telling him what was going to happen. I would learn this later. I did not know any of it on the morning of May 27th, when I woke up at 0445 hours in my house in Bowie and laid out my service dress blues on the back of the bedroom chair and took my old blank flight suit out of the cedar chest and got into the car and drove to Andrews to walk a flight line in the dark, the way I had walked a flight line in the dark before every command-relevant day of my career, since the day I pinned my wings advance in the spring of 2002. I walked a flight line in the dark because I had only ever wanted to be a pilot, and on the morning I was going to stop being a pilot and start being a wing commander, I wanted to walk the line one more time as just the body in the suit. I have walked a flight line in the dark before every command-relevant day of my life. The flight suit is blank because I have never wanted to be a colonel or a general on those walks. I have wanted to be the girl in 1996 who first put a hand on a cockpit ladder at Langley and could not breathe. I parked at the southwest gate at 05:15. I badged through. I walked toward the main apron. The light was the color of an old nickel. The 89th's VC-25 was parked under floodlights 300 yards north. Closer to me, on the east edge of the apron, 12 F-16C Fighting Falcons were staged in 2 rows. The 55th Fighter Squadron from Shaw Air Force Base. They were here for the Northeast Air Defense Joint Exercise that wrapped up that day. Their engines were not hot. A handful of pilots in flight suits were doing pre-flight inspections under work lights. I walked the center line of the apron, hands in my flight suit pockets, looking at the airplanes the way I always had. I did not look at the people. The people this morning were not why I was there. Captain Riker Conway, 28 years old, 55 FS, had finished his walk-around. He was climbing the boarding ladder to his cockpit when he saw a figure crossing the apron 40 yards behind his jet. Female, by the silhouette. Flight suit, no vest. He squinted. No badge visible on a lanyard. No reflective belt, no escort. He paused with one boot on the 3rd rung, one hand on the ladder rail, and he cupped his other hand around his mouth. He had been told, repeatedly, by his squadron leadership to challenge any unidentified personnel on the flight line. He had never done it. He decided he would do it this morning. He shouted from the ladder, "Hey! Get off the tarmac, lady!" I kept walking. I did not turn my head. I did not look at him. The pace of my boots did not change. I had been walking flight lines in the dark for 24 years, and the one thing I had learned in all those mornings of all those years was that a flight line in the dark does not belong to the loudest person on it. He lifted the cupped hand again. He was going to shout it louder this time. He had, in his head, already started writing the after-action story for the Squadron bar that night. I caught a civvy on the apron at Andrews this morning. Can you believe it? 20 seconds later, he swung down off the ladder, landed on the concrete with both feet, and crossed the 40 yards in 11 strides. He was bigger than I was by 6 inches and 40 pounds. He had not, in his short life, ever had to slow down for a person who outranked him without warning. He caught me by the upper arm. He used more pressure than he should have. I stopped. I did not turn. I looked down at his hand on my sleeve, then at his face, then back at his hand. He flinched almost. He did not let go. He said, louder than he needed to, "Are you deaf? Civilians aren't allowed out here. Where's your badge?" I said, level and low. "Take your hand off my arm, Captain." He saw no rank on my sleeve. He saw no name tape. He saw a woman in a blank flight suit, hair in a tight knot at the base of the skull, who had the eyes of someone who had not been spoken to like this in a long time. He did not understand what he was looking at. He decided, in the absence of understanding, to double down. He said, "Yeah? And who are you? You got a name?" 40 yards behind him, Lieutenant Colonel Quinn Mercado, 55 FS Commander, had just stepped out from behind the nose of tail 910382 with a coffee in his hand. He had been talking to his crew chief. He saw in order his captain off the ladder, his captain across the apron, his captain's hand on a woman's arm. He started walking. He got close enough to see my face. He stopped dead. His coffee came down to his side. He had not seen this face in 3 years. He had seen it last in a Langley conference room across a table littered with mobility fighter integration slides. He had seen it again in a photograph in Air Force magazine in November of 2025 in a brigadier general's stars. He saw it now in a blank flight suit on his captain's apron with his captain's hand on the sleeve. He understood what he was looking at instantly. He walked the last 20 feet very slowly. He stopped next to Conway. He crossed his arms. He looked at Conway and not at me. He said, quiet and even, "Captain, that's your wing commander, son." Conway did not understand the sentence for a full second. Then he did. His hand fell off my arm of its own accord. His mouth opened. He took one step back. He looked at my name tape that was not there. He looked at my shoulder rank that was not there. He looked at my eyes, which were not friendly. He could not speak. I said, still level, "Captain Conway, is it? Lieutenant Colonel Mercado, you're on my apron. Forgive me. Carry on with your launch sequence. Captain?" Parade ground, 1400 hours, dress blues. You will be in the third row, on the aisle. I will see you there. Do not be late. I turned. I walked past my own footprints, back the way I had come. I did not look at Conway again. I did not look at Mercado either. Mercado saluted my retreating back with 2 fingers off the brim of his ball cap, the old pilot's salute, the one you use when there's too much weather to think. I walked to my car. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time. The light was changing. The first edge of sunrise was on the eastern fence line. I put my hands on the steering wheel. I did not start the car. I sat there. I had not been touched like that on a flight line in 24 years. I had never been touched like that on a flight line by a captain. I had never, in any career, been called lady in the middle of a sentence that included the word tarmac. I had also never been on the morning of a change of command at the 89th Airlift Wing with the man who had not said my name in 8 months in the front row of the parade ground, waiting for me, 4 hours from now, in his retired lieutenant colonel's mess dress. I had a long day ahead of me. The captain was the easy part of it. The captain I would deal with at 1600. The hard part of the day was already loaded into the front row of a parade ground 25 minutes from where I was sitting, and the hard part had been loaded there by my mother in February, in March, in April, and the hard part was not going to walk away. I started the car. I drove to the 89 Operations Group building. Major Tracy Beresford, my executive officer, was already at the front desk with a coffee in one hand and the morning brief in the other. She read my face quickly and without comment. She followed me into the inner office and closed the door behind her. I sat at the desk. The change of command program was on the blotter. The seating chart for the parade ground was on top of it. Russell Holloway, retired Lieutenant Colonel USAF, was listed in the front row, third from the aisle. Tracy asked me in her flat aide's voice whether there was anything she should add to the morning brief. I said, "No. Get me Colonel Sokol." Colonel Daria Sokol arrived in her own service dress with the day's program tucked under her arm. She was a year older than me, a year ahead of me at the academy, 6 inches taller. She had known me for 30 years. She sat without being asked. She read my face. She waited. She said, "What happened on the line?" I said, "A captain from Shaw grabbed my arm and told me to get off his apron." She said, "Tell me he's still alive." I said, "I told him to be on the parade ground at 1400. She said, after a long pause, "You wore the blank suit." I said, "I wore the blank suit." She said, "Of course you did." Daria has been the witness. She has been the only person who saw it from the inside, not Bennett. Bennett saw it from the side aisle. Daria saw it from the middle pew. She poured 2 cups of coffee from the carafe Tracy had set up on the side table. She put one in front of me. She sat down across the desk. She said, "Your father is going to be in the front row at 1400 in his blues." I said, "I know." She said, "Have you thought about what you're going to say to him?" I said, "I'm not going to say anything to him. I'm going to take command of his old wing in front of him." She said, "Ange," I said, and this was the first crack of the morning, "Daria, he didn't come to the DFC, he didn't come to my squadron command, he didn't come to my colonel pin. He came to the BG ceremony at the Pentagon and stood at the receiving line and shook my hand and said, 'Congratulations,' the way a stranger says it to a stranger. He is going to be in the front row today because his wife and his son made him come. And I am going to take command. And then I will see what he does." She said, "And what if he stands up?" I said, "Then he stands up. It does not change what I have already done." She nodded. She drank her coffee. She did not push. I had thought, the day I pinned my star at the Pentagon, that the silence had been won. I was beginning to understand, sitting in that office at 0625 hours on the morning of my own change of command, that the silence had only been deferred until today. The Air Force does not give you a test in advance. It just gives you the day. The phone rang at 0834 hours. Tracy put it through immediately. Mercado was on the line. He had skipped the wing front desk. He had asked for me direct. He said, "Ma'am, Lieutenant Colonel Mercado, 55 FS. I owe you a phone call about my captain." I said, "Colonel," he said, "Ma'am, I want to be on the record that I will personally process an Article 15 against Captain Conway today, this morning, before our launch home. I will have it on your desk before lunch." He laid hands on a general officer. I do not care what he thought he was looking at. He laid hands on you. He's mine, and he is going to learn from this in the worst possible way. I let the silence sit for 2 beats. I said, Colonel, hold off on the paperwork. He said, Ma'am, with respect. I said, I heard you, Quinn. Hold off on the paperwork. Where is he now? He said, sitting outside my office, ma'am, not speaking. I said, send him to the parade ground at 1300. Dress blues. He stands in the 3rd row, on the aisle, the seat I told him to take this morning. After the ceremony, I want him in my office at 1600. You're welcome to attend. Bring his record. There was a longer pause. He said, Ma'am. I said, Quinn, I am not letting him off. I am keeping him. He understood. I had served with him for 2 years at Air Combat Command. We had both learned, somewhere along the line, the most important lesson of Squadron Command. The worst thing you can do to a young pilot who has just done something stupid is destroy him in writing. The second worst thing is to do nothing. The first best thing is to take him into the office and keep him in the room. I had learned that lesson from Bruce Vandermeer at Vance in 2002. He had used it on me the night I almost ground looped a T-1 on a crosswind landing, and he had kept me in the room until I had understood, with my whole face on my hands, what I had almost done. I had been waiting for 24 years to use that lesson. I was going to use it on a captain who 20 minutes ago had my arm in his hand. I called my mother at 0930 hours. She picked up on the second ring. She was already dressed in her good dress and her good hat. My father was in the basement. She said, Angie, are you ready, sweetheart? I said, I'm ready, Mom. She said, your father is wearing the blues. He pressed them himself last night. He did not let me near them. I said, okay. She said, he has not said anything about it. He has not said your name out loud since the BG ceremony. I think today might be the day. I said, Mom, you don't have to manage it. She said, I have managed it for 47 years. I am not stopping today, Angela. Today, of all days. There was a silence on the line. The first time she had used my full first name in the conversation. The first time in any phone call I could remember. She had declined to be the soft enabler. I closed my eyes. I said, all right, Mom, I'll see you at 14. She said, I will save your father a seat. Tracy brought in the final program at 10:14. I reviewed it. Front row, incoming wing commander's family on the right of the aisle, outgoing wing commander's family on the left. Russell, Maeve, Bennett, plus Bennett's wife and the 2 teenagers, on the right. Behind them, the senior leadership. The 11th Wing CC, the JBA installation, CC, the Joint Staff J3 representative. The Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force was presiding. Major General Charles Whitford was the outgoing commander. The 1st Airlift Squadron, my old squadron, was providing the troop formation. 2 C-17s and the VC-25 were on the static display. I put on the uniform at 13:38 hours. Service dress blues, 2 rows of ribbons, command pilot wings. The star, brand new, on each shoulder, the Brigadier General's single star with the bend in the field of the shoulder board. The star was heavier than the Silver Eagle ever was. I had not believed people when they told me that, and now I believed them. I looked at myself in the mirror. I did not see my father. I did not see my brother. I saw the woman who had walked the apron at 0517 and had not looked at the F-16 captain when he grabbed her arm. I nodded at my own reflection. The star is not heavier because of metal. It is heavier because of every chair that was empty at every ceremony before it. Today, the chair would not be empty. He was going to sit in it. And I was going to take command of his old wing while he sat in it, and the only person who had to keep going was me. So I kept going. The parade ground was on the south side of the wing complex. The formation was already drawn up when I arrived at 13:52 hours. The 1st Airlift Squadron in service dress in 3 companies, perfectly squared. The wind was light from the southwest. The VC-25 was on the static display behind the dais, the great blue and white of the presidential aircraft against an early summer sky. I entered from the right with Tracy half a pace behind me. Whitford was already on the dais. The vice chief was on the dais. The base chaplain was at the right podium. I took my position on the left of Whitford. I did not look at the front row. I had trained for 30 years not to look at the front row. I was going to maintain that training for 40 more minutes. In the 3rd row on the aisle, Captain Riker Conway sat in his service dress blues. His silver wings were clean. His captain's bars were unsmudged. He had not spoken to a single member of his squadron since 0526, except to confirm that he would, in fact, be at the parade ground at 1300. Mercado was 2 rows behind him, arms crossed, eyes on the back of Conway's head. Conway could feel them. He had not yet allowed himself to imagine what 1600 was going to look like. In the front row, third from the aisle, Russell Holloway sat in his mess dress blues. He had not worn this uniform since he retired in 1997. My mother had helped him with the tie. He had my mother to his right, Bennett to his left, Bennett's wife on the far left, Bennett's son and daughter on the far, far left. He had not spoken since they parked the car. His hands rested on his knees in a way I, watching out of the corner of my eye when I did not mean to watch, recognized from my childhood. He used to sit that way after a long sortie. The way a man sits when he is trying very hard not to think about how heavy the day has been. The chaplain finished the invocation. The vice chief made the opening remarks. Whitford gave his outgoing speech. He spoke for 9 minutes about the wing, the mission, the obligation of the presidential airlift, and the woman taking the colors. He said, near the end, "I have served in this Air Force for 33 years. I have never been more confident handing off a wing than I am today. The 89th has the commander it deserves." He turned to me. He held out the wing colors. The flag was heavy at the staff. I stepped forward. I took it with both hands. The roll of drums was short and clean. The vice chief took the colors next, passed them ceremonially to me, and stepped back. I held the colors out in front of me. I turned 1/4 to the right and faced the formation. I held them. I have held a yoke at 55,000 feet with the wings of an aircraft in my hands. I have held the throttles of a heavy, on short final into a base under fire. I have held my own niece for the first time when she was 4 pounds and the size of a loaf of bread. None of those things weighed what this weighed. The colors of an Air Force wing in the hand of the woman who commanded it weighed more than the things she carried with them. They weighed the weight of who didn't think she could. I passed the colors to my color guard. I stepped back to center. I faced the audience. I began my remarks. My remarks were short because I had prepared short remarks. I talked about the wing's history. I talked about the men and women in the formation. I talked about the obligation. I did not talk about my father. I did not look at my father. I finished. I thanked the vice chief. I thanked Major General Whitford. I turned to face the formation for the final time. At that exact moment, in the front row, third from the aisle, Russell Holloway stood up. He stood up alone. My mother did not stand. Bennett did not stand. None of the senior officers in the second row stood. The audience was supposed to be seated. Russell Holloway, retired Lieutenant Colonel, USAF, in his mess dress blues, stood by himself in the front row, brought his right hand up smartly to the brim of his cap, and saluted his daughter. He held the salute. He held it for the full count of 3. He held it for the count of 4. He held it. Then he dropped it. Then he sat down. The vice chief noticed. The vice chief, after a half-second's hesitation, returned the salute himself. Whitford saluted. The wing commanders in the second row saluted. The senior NCOs saluted. The formation saluted. By the time I had counted to 2, I was being saluted by the entire parade ground. I was unable to move for a full second. Then I returned the salute. I held it. I held it until my arm was shaking. I held it longer than I needed to. I held it long enough that Darya Sokol, in the second row behind my father, would tell me later that the tear had come down her cheek and not mine, which was the only consolation she could offer to a person she had known for 30 years. In a voice no one but my mother heard, after he sat down, my father said, "Well done, General Holloway." The receiving line in the officers' club ballroom was 40 people long. I stood at the end of it, with Tracy at my left elbow and Darya at my right. I greeted each guest by name. The line moved slowly because that is what receiving lines do. My mother was 4th from the end of the line. My father was 5th. Bennett and his family were 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th. My mother reached me at 15:51 hours. She did not say a word. She put her arms around me for a long time in the middle of the receiving line with the room watching. She kissed me on the cheek. She stepped back. She nodded. She moved on. Tracy's hand was shaking. My father reached me at 15:52 hours. He stopped in front of me. He was 6 inches shorter than I remembered. He had gotten smaller in the way men of his generation get smaller after a certain birthday. He looked up at me. He raised his hand to salute me again. I caught his hand at the wrist, gently, and put it down. I shook his hand instead. I held it. I said, "Hi, Dad." He said, "Angie, General Holloway." I said, "Dad." He said, "You held the colors well." I said, "You stood up." He said, "I should have stood up at the DFC. I should have stood up at the Squadron command. I should have stood up at the Colonel pin. I should have stood up at the BG ceremony. I have stood up in my head for 9 years. I have not been able to do it with my body. I do not know why. It does not matter why. I am too old to know why." I said, "Dad." He said, "I would like to come to dinner Sunday if you would have me." I waited a long time before I answered. I said, "Bring Mom." He said, I will bring her." He squeezed my hand. He moved on. He did not look back. My mother, ahead of him, had stopped in the doorway. He caught up to her. He took her arm. They walked out together. Bennett reached me at 15:54 hours. He was in a charcoal suit. His wife was in pearls. He did not, in the line, do anything theatrical. He shook my hand. He said quietly, "I should have stood up too. I will next time. The kids think you're cool. I think you're cool. I'm sorry, Ange." I did not say anything for a moment. Then I said, "Stop apologizing for what he is." He stood up. Bennett nodded. He did not say anything else. He moved on. My brother had nothing to apologize for. He had been a younger child in a house where the wrong cockpit had become the family's whole religion. He had survived by going where the wind blew. I had never resented him for that. He was just my brother. At 5 minutes to 1600, Captain Riker Conway knocked on my office door. Tracy let him in. Mercado was already in the office, in service dress, standing in the corner with his hands folded behind him. Conway stopped in the center of the room and stood at attention. He was sweating. I did not invite him to sit. I said, "Captain, at ease." He said, "Ma'am." I said, "I want you to understand 3 things. First, you laid hands on a general officer this morning. There is no version of this Air Force in which that is acceptable. Lieutenant Colonel Mercado offered to process an Article 15 against you before lunch. I declined that. You will not be punished today. You will instead spend the next 90 days as a temporary duty exchange officer to my wing. You will fly nothing. You will read everything. You will learn what a mobility wing does. At the end of 90 days, you will write me a paper on the difference between a fighter pilot and an airlift pilot, and the difference will not be aircraft. The difference will be mission. Second, the reason I am not letting you off and the reason I am not destroying you is that 24 years ago, a major named Bruce Vandermeer at Vance Air Force Base did neither of those things to me when I did something stupid. He kept me. I am keeping you. Third, Captain, if you ever again, on any flight line of any base on any apron of this Air Force, speak to any uniformed person before you know their rank, I will personally see to it that the next conversation you have is a flying evaluation board. Are we clear, Captain Conway? He said, "Yes, ma'am." I said, "Lieutenant Colonel Mercado. He's yours until 17:30. He's mine starting Monday. Dismissed." Conway saluted. Mercado nodded. They both filed out. I sat in the chair behind the desk after the door closed. I said to nobody, "Bruce, I hope I am using that lesson the way you meant it." The months that followed were quieter. The grievance with my father did not close. It just stopped being the only sound in the room. By August, I had the wing in steady state. The summer training cycle had concluded. The fall mission load was briefed. I was, in the language my father used in his head, the commander now. Bruce Vandermeer called me from Niceville, Florida, on the 14th of August. He had read the Air Force magazine story on my change of command. He had, he said, kept the article. He asked me how I was holding up. I told him about Conway. I told him about the lesson he had given me in 2002 and about how I had used it. He was quiet for a long moment, and he said, "Angie, the lesson was always you. I just said the words. You were the one who heard them. Use the lesson on every one of them. And listen. The captain who grabbed your arm, he will be a colonel one day if you keep him. And he will tell that story for the rest of his career. He will tell it to every lieutenant who comes through his door. He will tell it as the morning he learned what a wing commander is. That's how it works. We make the next ones with the mistakes of the last ones. You're doing the work. Keep doing it. I said, yes, sir. He said, don't sir me. I haven't been sir for 13 years. I said, old habits. He said, best ones. Sunday dinners at the Holloway house started in June. My father grilled steaks on the back deck because my father had spent 40 years grilling steaks and the muscle memory was incorruptible. My mother made the potato salad. Bennett came with his wife and the teenagers. The boy, 12, asked me at one point whether I had ever flown the president. I said yes, several times. He went quiet. My father, at the grill, smiled into the smoke. My mother, watching from the kitchen window, dried her hands on a dish towel. The image for a half second was 1986. Then it was 2026 again. At the table, lifting his beer, my father said, to the general. I said, to the wing. He said, to the general of the wing. He drank. Bennett drank. My mother drank. The two teenagers drank apple cider. The toast was short, and it was the first one he had given at his own table in a decade. Conway, by mid-September, was 60 days into his 90. He had been quiet. He had read everything I had sent him. He had flown nothing. He had sat in the right seat of 2 VC-25 simulators for orientation because I had ordered him to understand the mission. He came out of the sim quieter than he had gone in. He came to my office to ask if I would read draft 4 of his paper. It was, in places, good. He had understood what I had meant in May. He had written that fighters and airlifters were not different cockpits. They were different verbs. The fighter said strike. The airlifter said bring. Both were necessary. Neither was bigger. I wrote a single line at the top of the cover sheet. Captain Conway, you understand. Pass. Return to Shaw on schedule. Stay in touch. Holloway. The vice chief called on a secure line late on a Friday afternoon in the last week of September. He was not supposed to tell me. He told me anyway. The next Major General Selection Board had concluded. I had been selected 2-star. The pinning would be in March of 2027. He said he had some ideas about my next command. I thanked him. I hung up. I sat at my desk for a long time. I looked at the wing colors in the corner of the office. I picked up the phone. I called my mother. I said, Mom. The board met. She said, tell me, Angie. I said, I'm a 2-star. She said, oh, sweetheart. I said, don't tell Dad yet. Let me tell him Sunday. She said, Sunday. That Sunday, the whole family was at the table. My mother had not told my father. Bennett was in the kitchen helping with the salad. The teenagers were setting the table. I waited until the steaks were on the plates and the potatoes were passed. I waited until my father had lifted his beer. He said, to the general. I said, to the 2-star. The table stopped. Bennett, holding a salad bowl with both hands, set it down very slowly. My mother, who already knew, lifted a hand to her mouth anyway. The boy, 12, said, Aunt Angie, what's a 2-star? Bennett, recovering first, said, a 2-star, buddy, is 1 star more than a 1-star. The boy said, oh. My father did not speak for a full count of 5. He set down his beer. He stood up. He walked around the table to where I was sitting. He put his hand on my shoulder. He squeezed once. He said quietly, Major General Holloway. I said, Dad? He said, I have been wrong about you for 47 years. I am going to spend the rest of the years I have getting that wrong. He sat down. The table ate. The steaks were good. Bennett told a story about a Delta crew that almost ran out of fuel into Anchorage in 2018, and the table laughed because Bennett knew that the way to follow a hard moment at a Holloway table was with an airplane story. And he was, in this respect, finally his father's son, too. 1 week later, I asked Tracy to find a left seat opportunity for me on a domestic C-32 flight. Tracy, who had worked for me for a year and who had learned by then to ask no questions about the dawn walk ritual and its descendants, just nodded and found the flight. There was a joint staff support hop to Wright-Patterson the following Wednesday. I put myself on the manifest as aircraft commander. I put my father on the manifest as an authorized observer, retired Lieutenant Colonel, USAF. I did not tell him. I picked him up at the Bowie House at 04:30 hours on the 10th of September. He was in slacks and a sport coat because I had told him to dress comfortably. I did not tell him where we were going. He suspected. He did not ask. We drove to Andrews in silence. We passed through the southwest gate. I parked at the 89 OG building. I walked him through the building, through the briefing room, through the suit-up area. I handed him a flight suit. It was a borrowed one, in his size, with no name tape and no rank. He looked at me. I looked back. He put it on. We walked out to the apron together. A C-32 was on the line, fueled, ready. My crew was going through the pre-flight. They snapped to attention when they saw me. I nodded at them. I walked my father up to the boarding stairs. I pointed him to the jump seat behind the captain's chair. I said, "Dad, you sit there. You don't touch anything. You don't talk on the radio. You watch." He said, "Angie." I said, "Get on the airplane, sir." He climbed the stairs. He did not look back at me. He sat in the jump seat. I climbed into the left seat. I ran my checklists. I talked to Joint Base Andrews Ground. I talked to Joint Base Andrews Tower. I received my clearance. I advanced the throttles. We lifted off the runway in the new light of an early September morning. The C-32 lit up the climb easily. I leveled at 28,000. The Chesapeake was silver and gold below the cockpit window. The Atlantic glinted to the east. To the west, the Blue Ridge. My father, in the jump seat behind me, did not speak for the first 30 minutes. He just watched. I did not look back at him. I did my job. I trimmed. I talked to the controllers in clipped, calm phrases. I listened to my co-pilot. I did my job the way I had always done my job. Eventually, when we had leveled, when the autopilot was on and the workload was light, I half turned in the seat and looked at my father. He was looking out the window. He was not looking at me. He was looking at the country. He said, "Angie." I said, "Dad." He said, "I see it." I said, "I know." He said, "I have been an old fool." I said, "You've been a pilot, Dad. They overlap." He laughed. It was the first time I had heard him laugh in 9 years. He laughed the way he used to laugh in 1986 when I was 8 and he was on the lawn in his flight suit. The laugh did not change the past, because the past cannot be changed. It just resettled in the present in a way that allowed the future to take place. He had never asked me what it looked like. He had assumed for 30 years that it could not look like anything, because he had not flown it. He had assumed that the cockpit he had not chosen was not a cockpit. He was wrong. The country looks the same from every cockpit. The country looks the way the country looks. It is a question only of whether you have earned the window. We landed back at Joint Base Andrews at 18:41 hours. My father debarked behind my crew in the borrowed flight suit. The crew gathered on the apron for the after-action chat. My father stood a polite distance away. When we broke, I walked over to him. He was watching the airplane I had just landed. He was not looking at me. He said, "I have not been on an Air Force airplane since 1997. I said, "I know, Dad." He said, "I had forgotten what it feels like." I said, "I know." He said, "Thank you, Angie. General, Major General, whichever." I said, "Dad, just Angela." We drove home. The traffic on the Beltway was what it was. He fell asleep in the passenger seat with his head against the window. I drove with one hand on the wheel and one hand on the gear shift. I did not turn on the radio. I let him sleep. When I pulled into the driveway in Bowie, my mother was on the porch in her cardigan. She had been waiting. She saw my father asleep in the passenger seat in the borrowed flight suit, and she put her hand to her mouth, and she was crying, and I rolled the window down and said, very quietly, "Mom, he flew with me." If you have ever sat in a chair while a parent looked through you, I want to tell you this. You don't fix it by becoming what they wanted. You fix it by becoming what you are all the way, without apology, until the day they look at you and finally see what you are and what they failed to see. They may never apologize. Mine did. Most don't. It does not matter. You did not become what you became to be apologized to. You became it because the cockpit was always yours. Earn the window. The country looks the same from every one of them. Take care of yourselves. If you have ever walked into a room you earned and been treated like you didn't belong there, I want you to remember the apron at Andrews. I did not raise my voice. I did not pull away. I let the truth do its own work, and the truth did it. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been mistaken for someone who shouldn't be where you are? Was it a stranger, or was it someone who should have known better? And what did you do in that moment when you decided you were not going to argue with them? I want to hear it. If this one stayed with you, hit subscribe and I'll see you in the comments.